My mother's hysterical sobs about my father's death were a blood-soaked lie to steal my inheritance. I'm Ariadne, and while my brother was busy smashing my life for a payout, I was planning my own murder. To beat a family of vultures, you have to become a ghost. But before the fire, I was just a soul seeking sanctuary in the only light that never lied. The blue glow of 4 separate monitors washed over my face, the only light in a room designed for silence and secrets. Outside the reinforced glass of my Chicago office, the late November rain blurred the city skyline into a smudge of charcoal and neon. I like the coldness of this world. In digital security, logic is king. Data doesn't lie, and code doesn't have a hidden agenda. After years of navigating the jagged emotional minefields of my family back in Lake Forest, I had carved out this sanctuary of bytes and firewalls. I had always believed that integrity is the only thing the fire cannot burn, a principle that kept me upright when my own flesh and blood tried to make me feel small. My fingers glided lightly across the mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clicks creating a steady tempo for the running servers. I was the youngest daughter, whom they considered too sensitive to take over the family business, the one they thought would ultimately fail. They were wrong. I didn't fail. I simply moved elsewhere. I built a fortress of solitude because, in my experience, distance is the only effective filter for harmful things. Yet, as I stared at an encrypted data packet, a memory flashed through my mind. My father, Arthur, teaching me how to restore an old watch in his dusty workshop. He was the only one who ever looked at me and saw a human being, not a pawn. His hands were so steady then, faintly smelling of cedar wood and oil. That was the only warmth I carried with me to this cold city. The silence of the skiff was shattered by the sharp, intrusive vibration of my personal phone. It rattled against the metal desk like a warning. I didn't recognize the number, but the area code was 847, Lake Forest. My stomach did a slow, nauseating roll. I hesitated, my professional armor tightening. In this business, you learn to anticipate the breach before it happens. I picked it up, and before I could even say hello, the sound of a woman's shattered breathing filled my ear. It was a sound I knew too well, a performance I had witnessed a dozen times before, yet it still had the power to make my blood turn to ice. Ariadne? Oh my God, please answer me. It was Lavinia. My mother's voice didn't just convey sound, it carried an air of orchestrated disaster. The panic was perfect, high-pitched, urgent, and sharp enough to pierce my composure. It's your father. He's in the garage. There was a lot of noise, then silence. The doctor said it was a terrible heart attack. He was trying to fix your old car. He wanted it to be a surprise for your 30th birthday. He did it for you. The guilt hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. She wasn't just telling me he was dying. She was telling me it was my fault. Logic screamed at me to pause. Why was she calling me instead of an ambulance? Why was she so articulate in her despair? But the daughter in me, the little girl who still remembered the smell of cedarwood, took the wheel. My professional detachment evaporated, replaced by a visceral, heart-pounding anxiety. I had spent years running away to save my soul, but I never intended to leave him behind to face the end alone. Is the ambulance there, Mother? Did you call 911? I heard my own voice, strained and unfamiliar. There was a pause on the other end, just a fraction of a second too long, before the sobbing redoubled. They're coming, but you have to hurry. He was asking for you, Ariadne. Please, just come home. I didn't wait for more. I grabbed my coat, my fingers trembling as I struggled with the buttons. I told myself I was going back because it was my moral responsibility. I told myself it was love. But as I sprinted toward the elevator, a cold thought remained. I was walking back into the cage, and I was doing it willingly. The drive north was a cinematic blur of white knuckles and blinding snow. The bright, orderly lights of Chicago faded into the dark, eerie tunnels formed by the towering oaks of the North Shore. The windshield wipers struggled against the heavy Illinois slush, a rhythmic thud-thud that echoed the throbbing in my temples. I wondered if we ever truly escape our origins, or if we are just on a long leash, waiting for the right tug to pull us back into the mud. The wounds of family are often the deepest because they are inflicted by those who have the map to our hearts. They know exactly where to strike to make the blood flow. I pulled into the long, winding driveway of the Gables, the tires of my car crunching over fresh snow that hadn't been disturbed by any emergency vehicles. The mansion sat there like a dark, Gothic sentinel, its windows unlit and vacant. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, no frantic neighbors. The only sign of life was a single flickering fluorescent bulb in the detached garage at the far end of the property. The silence was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, something that didn't belong at a medical emergency. I stepped out of the car, the freezing air biting at my skin. I took a breath, expecting the medicinal tang of a crisis, but the atmosphere was different. Have you ever trusted someone you shouldn't have just because they were the only family you had left? I stood there for a second, looking at the looming shadow of my childhood home. My mind, trained to spot inconsistencies, began to catalog the red flags I'd ignored in my panic. The driveway was too still. The house was too dark. And as I walked toward the garage, the wind shifted, bringing a scent that made my spine stiffen. It wasn't the smell of a heart attack. It was the pungent, unmistakable reek of copper and gasoline. The heavy metal door groaned as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the pre-dawn stillness of Lake Forest like a dying breath. I had expected a scene of medical urgency. Paramedics, the smell of antiseptic, the frantic beep of a heart monitor. Instead, I was met with a terrifying hollow silence that felt heavier than the blizzard outside. The air didn't hold the frantic energy of a life being saved. It held the cold, calculated stillness of a trap. My pulse, which had been racing since Chicago, suddenly flattened into a low, thrumming dread. I took a step forward, my boots crunching not on snow, but on the jagged remains of my own independence. My Tesla lay slumped in the parking lot, just the empty shell of the car I'd bought to prove I didn't need the Walker name. The windows were gone, leaving a sea of sharp shards scattered across the concrete. The tires were so badly ripped the car looked like it was kneeling in shame. But it was the spray-painted words that choked me up. The word selfish scrawled on the hood in blood-red letters, the paint still dripping like an open wound. I stared at it, feeling the weight of every year I'd tried to be good enough for them. The truth wasn't in what people said, but in what they did when they thought no one was watching. This was the second time my childhood had ended. I moved deeper into the shadows, my eyes searching for any sign of my father. There were no oil spills from a struggle, no scuff marks from a falling body, no discarded medical wrappers. The garage was pristine, except for the violence inflicted on my property. My mind began to shed its panic, replaced by the cold, analytical frost of a security expert. I knelt by the workbench and saw something that stopped my heart. Lying among the glass shards was a small, hand-carved wooden bird. My father had made it for me when I was 7, a totem of his quiet love in a house of loud ambitions. I picked it up, the rough cedar wood biting into my palm, and realized that even in their greed, they were careless with the things that actually mattered. The emergency was a staged production, a theatrical luring of the youngest daughter back into the kill zone. I stood up, my eyes narrowing as I looked at the garage's security hub. The red light was dead. They had cut the main feed. They thought they had blinded me. It's a common mistake people make with those they consider weak. They assume we don't have eyes of our own. I reached into my pocket and tapped the encrypted link on my watch. My car was a fortress of sensors, and unlike the house, its sentry mode didn't rely on the mansion's compromised grid. The cloud connection flared to life, a blue interface shimmering against the darkness of the garage. The playback began in a haunting, high-definition infrared glow. I watched my own brother, Caspian, step into the frame with a crowbar, his face contorted not with grief, but with a terrifying, ecstatic rage. He swung at the glass with a rhythm that suggested he had been practicing this in his mind for years. And then, Lavinia appeared. My mother didn't touch the car. She simply stood by the door, draped in her cashmere coat, checking her Cartier watch with an expression of profound boredom. "Make it look like a hate crime, Caspian." Her voice drifted through the tiny speaker, cold and thin. "The insurance payout is the only way to fix the liquidity problem before the trust matures." I watched them for 5 minutes, a mother and son discussing the destruction of my life as if they were debating the color of new drapes. To forgive is a gift to oneself, but to trust again without change is a betrayal of one's own soul. I didn't scream. I didn't run into the house to demand an explanation. Instead, I stood in the wreckage and initiated a triple redundant download to my secure servers in Chicago and London. I was no longer the worried daughter they had called at 3 a.m. I was a digital ghost, and I was starting to build a case that would burn their world to the ground. The snow continued to pile up against the garage door, sealing us all in this gothic tomb. If you saw your own flesh and blood destroying your life through a lens, would you confront them with rage, or wait until the law did it for you? I knew the answer for me. Anger is a luxury I couldn't afford. Precision was my only weapon. I pulled my coat tighter, feeling the cold seep into my bones, but my mind was a furnace of strategic thought. In Illinois, recording conversations is a legal labyrinth, but the preservation of truth requires the gathering of every shard of evidence, regardless of the risk. I reached for my phone and activated the background recording app, ensuring the microphone was unobstructed. I needed their voices. I needed their confessions. I needed to see how far the rot had spread into the foundation of my life. I walked over to the workbench and placed the carved wooden bird in the center, a silent message they wouldn't understand until it was far too late. It was a marker of the girl I used to be, left behind in the ruins of the garage. I wasn't that person anymore. The woman who was about to walk through those mansion doors was someone they didn't recognize. I stepped out of the garage and into the biting wind. The lake forest swung moo, swallowing the house in a gray shroud. The gables looked like a hungry mouth waiting to close. Every window was a dark eye watching my approach. I felt the weight of the digital evidence in my pocket, a heavy, hidden power that made my footsteps steady on the ice. I knew that once I crossed that threshold, there was no going back. I was entering a den of wolves wearing my mother's face, and I had to play my part perfectly to survive. I wiped the glass dust from my coat, feeling the grit beneath my fingernails. My heart was a steady, rhythmic drum, synchronized with the cold logic of the plan forming in my mind. I reached for the heavy oak handle of the front door, the wood freezing against my palm. I took one final breath of the clean, honest air of the storm before stepping into the manufactured warmth of the foyer. The play was about to begin, and I was the only one who knew the ending. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and prepared to face the people who had already decided I was worth more dead than alive. The warmth of the foyer felt like a lie, a manufactured comfort designed to lower my guard as the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me. The scent of lavender and expensive floor wax filled the air, the same fragrance that had defined my childhood, yet now it smelled like a shroud. I stood on the Persian rug, feeling the weight of the digital evidence in my pocket. My mother, Lavinia, appeared at the top of the grand staircase, draped in a silk morning gown that flowed like liquid silver. She didn't look like a woman who had spent the night in a hospital waiting room. She looked like a queen preparing for an audience. "Ariadne, darling, thank God you made it," she cried, rushing down the steps with her arms outstretched. Her eyes were dry, but her voice was a symphony of practiced tremors. She squeezed my shoulders, her perfume cloying and suffocating. "It was a miracle. The private doctor we called, he stabilized your father just an hour ago. He's resting upstairs now. We didn't want the chaos of a public hospital. You know how your father values his privacy." I looked into her eyes, searching for a flicker of the mother who used to tuck me in, but I found only a cold, reflective surface. Alora stepped out from the library, holding a delicate china cup. "You look exhausted, Ariadne," she said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that didn't reach her calculating gaze. "Here, I made some herbal tea. You need to calm your nerves before we sit down for brunch." I looked at the dark liquid and felt a shiver of caution. I knew my sister. She never did anything out of simple kindness. Her eyes were roaming over my face, looking for a crack in my composure, a sign that I was ready to be broken. A house built on sand cannot withstand the tide of truth. My childhood home had become a hollow shell of deception, and I was the only one who could see the rot in the foundation. "I think I'll freshen up first," I said, my voice steady despite the revulsion twisting in my gut. I needed a moment away from their hungry eyes. They nodded, satisfied that I was playing the part of the distraught daughter. I walked toward the back of the house, but I didn't head for the guest suite. I waited until the sound of their voices drifted back into the dining room, discussing logistics and the future. Every step I took felt like I was walking through a minefield. I knew the layout of this mansion better than any of them. I knew the places where the shadows were deepest and the secrets were kept. I bypassed the main staircase and slipped behind the heavy tapestry near the pantry. There, a small, soundproof door led to the wine cellar. It was an old edition, reinforced with concrete and steel, intended for a vintage collection, but serving a far more sinister purpose today. I pushed the door open, the hinges silent from recent oiling. The air inside was chilled and stagnant. As I rounded the corner of the oak racks, my breath hitched. My father, Arthur, wasn't in a bedroom upstairs. He was slumped in a leather wing-back chair in the corner of the cellar, his head lolling to the side. I rushed to his side, my professional training taking over. He was breathing, but it was deep and unnatural. I looked at the stand beside him. An intravenous drip was feeding a clear liquid into his arm. My eyes traced the label on the vial. Midazolam, a high-dose sedative. They hadn't just faked an emergency. They had induced a chemical silence to keep the only honest man in this family out of the way. I felt a surge of protective fury, but I forced it down. Justice is not about the blow you strike, but the truth you reveal, I whispered into his ear, my hand trembling as I stroked his gray hair. I took out my phone and began to document everything. I took high-resolution photos of the drip, the vials, and the medical restraints on the chair. I used a small sterile kit from my bag to secure a blood sample. Undeniable forensic proof of their crime. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This was elder abuse and kidnapping. I kissed his forehead, a silent promise that I would get him out before slipping back into the hallway. I had the evidence I needed to destroy them, but I had to wait for the right moment to strike. By the time I entered the formal dining room, the emergency brunch was already served. The table was laden with smoked salmon, fresh fruit, and expensive coffee, the silver service gleaming under the chandelier. The air was thick with the smell of caffeine and cheap desperation. Lavinia was sitting at the head of the table, a stack of legal folders resting beside her plate. Caspian and Alora were already eating, their movements hurried and nervous. They looked like scavengers circling a carcass, and I realized I was the intended meal. Lavinia didn't waste time with pleasantries. She pushed a set of documents across the white linen tablecloth toward me. Ariadne, we need to discuss the trust. It matures on your birthday in 3 weeks, but the company is facing a temporary liquidity crisis. We need you to sign these papers now to authorize an early transfer. Family legacy requires personal sacrifice, darling. It's the only way to save your father's reputation from the mistakes he's made. The mask was finally off. She wasn't asking for help. She was demanding my life's work to pay for their greed. You're saying the $8.2 million is gone if I don't sign? I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. Caspian leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped his fork. We're saying the family name is worthless if you don't. Don't be selfish, Ariadne. You've been living your fancy life in Chicago while we've been holding things together here. It's time you did your part. Alora nodded in agreement, her eyes cold. I looked at them and felt a strange sense of peace. In the United States, a trustee cannot be coerced into a breach of fiduciary duty, and I was about to teach them exactly what that meant. I need to see the specific ledger of the company's debts before I sign anything, I said calmly, looking directly at Lavinia. Her eyes flashed with a sudden, predatory heat. She hadn't expected me to ask for data. She expected me to submit to the pressure of family. I saw the flicker of panic in her expression before she masked it with a tight, artificial smile. As I stared into my mother's cold, calculating eyes, I realized the woman who gave me life was now the primary architect of my destruction. The banquet was over, and the real war had begun. I retreated to my old bedroom, the floral wallpaper and childhood trophies feeling like a museum of a girl who had died long before this night began. The air here was stale, smelling of old paper and the faint, lingering scent of the rose water Lavinia used to spray on my linens. For a moment, I stood by the window, watching the lake forest fog roll across the lawn like a shroud. I looked at the small oak desk I had restored with my grandfather. It was a relic of a time when I believed the world was as solid as the wood we sanded. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled my laptop from its sleeve. The room was silent, save for the distant, rhythmic ticking of a clock downstairs. I wasn't here to sleep. I deployed my professional toolkit, the familiar lines of code scrolling across the screen like a digital lifeline. It took less than 10 minutes to bypass the house's rudimentary firewall and slip into Lavinia's private server. I've always believed that privacy is not a luxury, but the final boundary of the self. Tonight, I was tearing that boundary down. I needed the truth, no matter how much it burned. I peeled back the layers of my mother's digital facade, my eyes scanning encrypted financial folders. What I found wasn't just mismanagement. It was a graveyard. Walker Developments wasn't a thriving company. It was a catastrophic Ponzi scheme in its final death throes. I stared at the true ledger, a sea of red ink and forged signatures. The $8.2 million in my trust wasn't a save for the family business. It was a drop of water in a forest fire. My mother wasn't trying to protect our legacy. She was trying to buy a few more weeks of breathing room before the authorities arrived. The deeper I dug, the colder I became. I uncovered a hidden file buried in a subdirectory labeled Contingency. Inside was a life insurance policy, recently updated and placed on my life. The coverage was staggering, $10 million. Lavinia was the sole beneficiary. My hands felt numb as I opened a discarded draft in her trash bin. It was a suicide note. It was written in a poor imitation of my handwriting, detailing my supposed depression over the family's financial collapse. Ariadne is too fragile for this world, the note read. I stared at the words, feeling a cold sweat prickle my skin. The vandalism in the garage flashed through my mind. It hadn't been about the insurance money for the car at all. That was just a distraction, the first evidence of my supposed mental instability. They were setting the stage for a tragic end. The value of a person is often determined by the love they give, but to a predator, it is merely the price of their absence. My mother hadn't called me home because she missed me. She called me home because my death was worth more to her than my life ever was. I closed my eyes for a second, forcing my breathing to remain steady. I wasn't panicked. I was focused. I made a secure, encrypted call to Lyndon, my grandfather's former attorney. His voice was a steady anchor in the darkness. Ariadne, it's nearly midnight. Is everything all right? I didn't waste time. I transmitted the evidence of the fraud, the insurance plot, and the photos of my father in the cellar. They're planning to kill me, Lyndon, and they're holding my father captive. I need you to move now. What would you do if you realized your life's worth was calculated more in your death than in your presence by the person who gave you birth? The question hung in the air between us, heavy and unanswered. Lyndon didn't hesitate. I'm initiating the protocols, Ariadne. I'll have a secure team ready for your father. I felt a flicker of hope, but I knew I couldn't just run. No, I said, my voice stoic. I'm staying. I'm going to start the labyrinth protocol. If they want a ghost, I'm going to give them one they can never escape. True strength is not in the strike, but in the shield we hold for others. I wasn't just protecting my trust. I was protecting my father from the scavengers he called family. I began the process of erasing my digital footprint, setting up the triggers that would alert the federal authorities the moment the trust matured, or the moment I vanished. I was turning their hunger for my death into the very cage that would eventually imprison them. I spent the rest of the night meticulously preparing the evidence, ensuring every file was undeniable and every forensic trail was clear. I looked at the floral wallpaper one last time. This room didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a cocoon I was finally ready to shed. I thought about the little girl who used to hide in this closet during my parents' shouting matches. She was gone. The woman standing here now was an architect of her own fate. I realized then that my survival depended on my ability to play the victim one last time. I had to let them think they were winning, right up until the moment the trap snapped shut. I closed the laptop, the screen's glow fading from my eyes as I prepared to become the ghost they were so desperate to see. The house was silent now, but the air felt charged, as if the mansion itself was holding its breath. I stood up and walked to the door, my movements fluid and quiet. Tomorrow, the world would think Ariadne Walker was a tragic statistic. Only I would know the truth. I stepped out into the hallway, moving toward the shadows, ready to disappear into the labyrinth I had built for them. I slipped through the servants' entrance, the freezing Illinois air hitting my lungs like a physical wake-up call to the reality that my life was now a game of seconds. The ornate architecture of the gables, which used to feel like a fortress of family history, now looked like a jagged limestone cage. I kept my breathing shallow, moving through the shadows cast by the dormant oak trees. My car was gone, a mangled monument to their greed in the garage, so I headed for the secondary SUV parked in the north carriage house. Every snap of a twig under my boots sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence of the estate. The plan was simple. Get to the secure location Lyndon had prepared and wait for the extraction team to move on my father. The most dangerous maze is the one where the walls are made of people you once called home. I gripped the cold steering wheel, my mind a hyperactive radar scanning for any sign of movement. I hadn't been forgotten. I had been marked. I reversed the SUV slowly, keeping the headlights off until I cleared the iron gates. My pulse was a steady thrumming in my ears, a rhythmic reminder that I was still alive, despite their best efforts. I needed to disappear. I needed to become a ghost before they could make me one. But as I merged onto the winding cliffside road, a pair of high beams flared to life in my rearview mirror, slicing through the midnight fog. The light was blinding, a predatory glare that told me my escape had been anticipated. It was Caspian. I knew the silhouette of his black SUV as well as I knew my own reflection. He wasn't just following me, he was hunting. He closed the gap with a reckless velocity that suggested he had nothing left to lose. I pressed the accelerator, the engine roaring in protest as we tore through the serpentine bends of the Lake Forest coastline. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't just predicted my move, they had ensured they were part of it. I had spent years studying digital firewalls, but I had failed to see the human breach right in front of me. The chase moved toward the unlit, hazardous roads overlooking Lake Michigan, where the limestone cliffs dropped sharply into the churning, icy water. Caspian pulled alongside me, his heavy vehicle bumping against mine with a violent, metal-on-metal screech. Over the roar of the wind and the engines, I could hear him screaming taunts through his open window. He was raving about the stolen inheritance, about how I was a parasite who didn't deserve the Walker name. "You think you're so smart, Ariadne?" he bellowed, his face twisted in a manic grin. "We found the tracker. We saw everything you sent to that old man Lyndon. You're not going anywhere but the bottom of the lake." My blood turned to ice as he revealed the depth of their surveillance. He had placed a military-grade GPS tracker on the carriage house vehicle and cloned my phone's SIM card. Every encrypted message, every desperate plea for help, had been mirrored on his screen. I felt a momentary surge of absolute terror, a drowning sensation that threatened to paralyze my limbs. But then, the stoic clarity I had cultivated in the cold halls of Chicago took hold. Power is not in the weapon you hold, but in the belief that you have already lost everything. If they wanted a tragedy, I would give them a masterpiece. Instead of pleading or trying to ram him back, I shifted my focus to the car's internal telemetry. I was a security analyst. I knew exactly how these machines thought. I didn't need to outrun him, I needed to outthink him. I began to intentionally oscillate the steering wheel, mimicking the movements of a panicked, losing driver. I saw the spot ahead, a sharp hairpin turn where the guardrail had been weakened by the recent storms. It was the steepest point of the cliffs, where the water was deepest and the current strongest. I eased my foot off the brake, allowing Caspian to think he was finally pushing me over the edge. Caspian lunged his SUV forward for the final strike, intending to pit maneuver me through the railing. I watched his headlights in the mirror, counting the seconds. 3, 2, 1. I didn't fight the impact. I embraced it. At the exact moment of contact, I engaged the vehicle's emergency override, a sequence I had programmed into my watch hours ago. I triggered a controlled, high-speed skid that sent the car spinning toward the gap in the guardrail. In the eyes of anyone watching, it was a fatal loss of control. In reality, it was the opening move of Protocol Labyrinth. The cinematic climax felt like it was happening in slow motion. As the SUV's front tires left the asphalt and headed for the abyss, I executed the ejection. I didn't wait for the car to hit the water. I had spotted the pre-scouted ravine, a narrow, snow-filled crevice just inches from the cliff's edge. I rolled out of the driver's side door at the final possible second, my body hitting the freezing slush with a jarring impact that knocked the air from my lungs. I scrambled into the darkness of the rocks, clutching the frozen earth as I watched the vehicle plummet into the dark void of Lake Michigan. The car hit the jagged rocks below with a deafening metallic crunch before the gas tank ignited. A brilliant orange flare erupted against the white snow, illuminating the fog like a vengeful sun. Debris rained down into the water. Bits of glass, upholstery, and the suicide note Lavinia had meticulously prepared, now destined to be found by search teams as the final proof of my despair. Sometimes the only way to be seen as a person again is to first become a ghost in their eyes. I lay there in the freezing mud, my chest heaving, watching the smoke rise into the black sky. I looked up toward the cliff edge. Caspian's SUV had come to a screeching halt. He stepped out, silhouetted against the dying fire below. He stood there for a long time, peering over the precipice into the burning wreckage. Even from my hiding spot in the shadows, I could see the look of absolute triumph on his face. He believed he had won. He believed the $8.2 million was finally within his grasp. He didn't realize that by killing me, he had just handed me the keys to his own prison. He turned back to his car, his footsteps light and arrogant on the frozen road. As his taillights faded into the distance and the silence of the lake returned, the adrenaline began to subside, leaving me with a cold, hard resolve. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I didn't feel like the discarded youngest daughter who had been outmaneuvered by her own family. I felt like a hunter waiting for the sun to rise. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the secondary burner phone Lyndon had provided, the one they didn't know about. I sent a single, 3-word message to the secure server. The ghost lives. The wind began to howl again, whipping the snow into a frenzy, but I didn't move. I watched the spot where my car had vanished, a dark blot on the frozen surface of the lake. The play was moving into its final act, and my family was currently celebrating a victory that didn't exist. They thought they had erased me, but they had only given me the freedom to move unseen. I began the long, freezing trek toward the rendezvous point, my footsteps heavy but purposeful. The sun would be up in a few hours, and when it did, the Walker family would realize that some ghosts don't stay buried. I stood in the darkness of the hidden crawl space behind the library's oak paneling, watching my own funeral through a jagged gap in the wood. It was a somber, candlelit affair in the grand hall of the Gables, a masterpiece of funereal theater staged for an audience of local elites and unsuspecting business associates. The scent of lilies was so thick, it felt like a physical weight against my lungs. I was a ghost witnessing the living bury a lie, a silent observer of a family that had already moved on to the next transaction. Every flickering candle seemed to mock the memory of Ariadne, the girl who had spent 30 years trying to earn a seat at this table. Lavinia was at the center of the room, a vision of impeccable grief in black Italian lace. She dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief, her shoulders trembling with a precision that was terrifying to behold. Behind her, Caspian and Alora stood like sentinels of greed, their heads bowed in a performance of brotherly and sisterly loss. But I saw the truth. I saw the way Caspian's eyes kept darting towards the heavy mahogany desk in the study, and the way Alora's fingers nervously toyed with the clasp of her designer handbag. They weren't mourning a daughter or a sister. They were standing vigil over a bank balance. The most painful part wasn't their lack of grief. It was the total absence of my father. They had moved him to a facility for his recovery, or so they told the guests. In reality, he was still a prisoner of their chemical silence, tucked away in a place they thought I would never find. It was a cold realization that hit me harder than the icy waters of Lake Michigan. They hadn't just tried to erase my life. They had already erased my soul to celebrate the insurance payout. A man's character is his fate. I saw their fate sealed in every dry-eyed glance and every hushed conversation about the estate. The front door opened, and Lyndon entered the hall. He carried his leather briefcase with the somber dignity of a man coming to settle a debt. The air in the room seemed to sharpen as he moved toward the study, a silent signal that the theater was over and the business was beginning. My mother didn't hesitate. She excused herself from a group of weeping socialites and followed him into the private room, her movements swift and predatory. Caspian followed close behind, his face flush with a hunger he could no longer hide. Alora lingered in the doorway, the family's diplomatic scout, ensuring no one interrupted the closing of the deal. Lyndon sat at the desk and spread the documents across the polished surface like a deck of cards. "This is the final affidavit of loss and the formal life insurance claim," he said, his voice as cold and flat as a tombstone. He looked Lavinia directly in the eye. To proceed with the immediate distribution of the $10 million benefit, the primary beneficiary must swear under penalty of perjury that Ariadne Walker's death was an act of personal despair, resulting from her own mental instability. The air in the room felt like it was being sucked out. This was the trap, the final test of a mother's soul. Lavinia didn't even read the fine print. She reached for the gold fountain pen and signed her name with a flourish that made the paper scream. She effectively sold my memory, my dignity, and my existence for a check. Caspian immediately leaned in, his voice a harsh whisper. "Now, what about the first witness bonus? I was the one who saw her go over the cliff. I should get a supplemental payout for the trauma." I watched them through the gap in the wood, feeling a profound, hollow sadness. Forgiveness is letting go of the hope that the past could have been any different. My mother wasn't a monster born. She was a woman who had let greed eat her from the inside out until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. I watched as Lyndon subtly adjusted his glasses. The signal. He was looking directly at the hidden camera I had planted in the bookshelf hours before. Every signature, every whispered argument about the blood money, and every cold-blooded confession was being uploaded to the secure cloud in real time. It was all there. The undeniable logic of their betrayal, documented with forensic precision. Have you ever lost everything, your name, your home, your life, just to find the version of yourself that can never be broken? As the scavengers began to divide the spoils, I felt a strange, quiet power rising within me. I turned my gaze to the photo of my father that sat on the memorial table. He looked so young in that picture, so full of the cedarwood dreams he had tried to share with me. I realized then that I couldn't just wait for the law to take its course. I had to move first. I had to ensure his safety before the raid began. I whispered through the wall, my voice a barely audible ghost of a sound. "I am not taking revenge, Dad. I am taking us home." I wasn't just a security analyst anymore. I was a protector of the only legacy that mattered. The one built on truth, not on paper. The guests began to filter out of the grand hall, leaving the mansion to its shadows and its secrets. Lavinia and Caspian remained in the study, pouring glasses of expensive bourbon to toast their newfound wealth. They laughed about how easy it had been, mocking the girl who had always tried to play by the rules. I reached for the encrypted keypad I had installed in the crawlspace, my fingers steady and certain. I had built the digital labyrinth that surrounded this house, and I was about to turn their sanctuary into a cage. The red and blue lights were already miles away, but the justice was already here. I adjusted my headset and checked the feed one last time. Lyndon was exiting the room, his part in the play complete. I took a deep breath, the air in the crawlspace tasting of dust and imminent change. I didn't hate them. I simply no longer belonged to them. I was the ghost they had prayed for, and now I was the one who was going to answer those prayers. As I entered the final command into the terminal, I watched the locks on the study door engage with a heavy, final click. They were trapped in their own greed, and the sun was about to go down on the Walker name forever. The heavy silence of the study was broken not by a scream, but by the soft, mechanical chime of the mansion's smart home system. A system they forgot I designed. Within seconds, the atmosphere of smug celebration evaporated. Every high-definition television and tablet in the house flickered to life, the screens glowing with a predatory intensity. The footage from the garage began to play in a relentless loop, followed by the jagged shadows of the wine cellar and the clear, high-resolution image of Lavinia's signature on the fraudulent insurance claim. It was a digital resurrection, a broadcast of the truth they had tried so hard to bury beneath the lake forest snow. I stepped out from the shadows of the library's oak paneling, appearing like a phantom in my charcoal suit. The air in the room felt like it had turned to liquid nitrogen. Caspian's hand froze mid-air, the glass of champagne he was using to toast my death slipping through his fingers. It shattered against the hardwood floor, a spray of crystal and gold that mirrored the collapse of his confidence. He looked at me as if I were a vengeful spirit returned from the depths of Lake Michigan, his face draining of all color until it matched the winter sky outside. I stood before them, not as the victim Ariadne, but as the architect of their reckoning. My mother, Lavinia, gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, her knuckles white, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. I looked at her without malice, without the burning heat of revenge, but with the cold, immovable weight of justice. "Truth is like the sun, Mother," I said, my voice steady and echoing in the hollow room. "You can shut it out for a while, but it ain't going away." I wasn't there to argue. I was there to preside over the final chapter of their deception. Lyndon stepped forward, his leather briefcase open on the table. He didn't look at them with pity. He looked at them with the detached professionalism of a surgeon removing a tumor. "The probate documents you so eagerly signed," Lyndon announced, his voice cutting through the stagnant air, "were actually a voluntary confession of fraud, securities manipulation, and elder abuse. They were pre-authorized for the federal agents currently surrounding this property." The legal trap was as ironclad as the digital one. In the United States, the law is a slow-moving beast, but once it finds your scent, there is nowhere to hide. The red and blue lights began to dance against the frosted window panes, a rhythmic strobe of authority that signaled the end of the Walker era. The Grand Hall, which had just hosted a memorial for a living woman, was suddenly filled with the heavy boots of federal agents. Warrants for wire fraud and kidnapping were read aloud, the words clashing with the expensive decor of the room. Caspian made a final, desperate lunge toward me, his face contorted in a primal rage, but I simply sidestepped him with the disciplined grace of someone who had already moved beyond his reach. He was led away in handcuffs, his arrogance finally silenced by steel. Lavinia collapsed into a velvet chair, her silk handkerchief discarded on the floor. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with a sudden, desperate plea for family loyalty. It was the final move in her tired playbook. I knelt before her, not out of submission, but out of humanitarian grace. I took her cold, trembling hands in mine. "I am not doing this to hurt you, Mother," I whispered, my heart aching for the woman she could have been. "I am doing this so you can finally stop lying to yourself. You were so afraid of losing your status that you lost your soul instead." I reached into my jacket and pulled out a small, encrypted drive, the digital keys to a restitution fund I had established months ago. My grandfather's legacy wouldn't be used to bail out a failing Ponzi scheme. It would be used to pay back the innocent investors, the neighbors, and the retirees whose lives my family had treated like disposable assets. Intellectual strength isn't just about winning. It's about the responsibility we have to fix what others have broken. I handed the drive to Lyndon, ensuring that the healing of the community would begin the moment the house was cleared. I turned my back on the chaos of the arrests and headed for the wine cellar one last time. I personally led the paramedics down the stone steps, my heart thumping as we reached the back room. We found my father, Arthur, still caught in that sedated twilight. As they carefully moved him to a gurney, I leaned over and whispered into his ear, "It's over, Dad. We're going to a place where the air smells of cedarwood and truth." I had already arranged for his transfer to a private, high-end medical facility where he would receive the care he deserved, away from the scavengers who had held him captive. The final departure was quieter than I expected. I walked out through the heavy oak doors of the gables for the last time, the cold Illinois air feeling clean and honest against my face. I didn't take a single heirloom, a single piece of jewelry, or a single dollar that was tainted by their greed. I left it all behind, the furniture, the status, and the lie. Sometimes walking away isn't about giving up. It's about realizing that some things are too heavy to carry into your future. I had my father, my integrity, and a life that was finally, truly mine.